or do cranial nerves usually cross there? I know we learned about the optic.
I'll start there.
Okay.
That's a good place to start. There we go. Okay, so picking up where I left off about the three nerves that control the extraocular muscles, just one quick question that was asked. It's about this idea again of laterality. So when I say that information crosses the midline, that doesn't mean that if you think about a three neuron chain, it doesn't mean the fact that each axon crosses the midline. That means that eventually the information, if it takes three neurons to do it, one of those neurons' axon crosses the midline. So when you actually think about these neurons in the brainstem, like oculomotor, the neurons are located in the left side of the brain or the right side, and they project out to the left or right side of the body. So there's no crossing here. The crossing is actually higher in the information that regulates these neurons. Okay? So it's a little different. But when it comes to these cranial nerves, when you think of a left ocular motor lesion, it's either a lesion of the nerve or it's a lesion of the nucleus in the brain stem. Okay? So there's no crossing over here, except for optic, where we had 50% of the axons crossing. Okay? So when you think of these cranial nerves, lesions of the left have to do with the neurons on the left, the axons on the left. That's exactly what it applies to. Okay. So we did trigeminal, mentioning about the term ganglion, the fact that here's where you find these pseudo-unipolar neurons. Now, let me draw this now that I can actually draw it for you. I think this is a basic concept that you need to have as well. So, previous lecture, I mentioned this term pseudo-unipolar. The only reason why these neurons are referred to as being pseudo-unipolar is because pseudo means they're fake, right? They're not really. And that means is because embryologically they actually were bipolar neurons. Don't worry about that. That's where pseudo comes from. Mammals don't have true unipolar neurons. So only like invertebrates have them. So this neuron, this trigeminal neuron, so there's the nucleus nucleolus, looks like this. So it's a cell body on a stalk, and then it has these two processes. So what are the processes doing? So if you think about the neurons, these neurons here that reside in that trigeminal ganglion right there, what are they doing? They are having one of their processes coming out here, and let's just say skin. So for pain. So they're picking up the pain information. And that pain information flies down the axon. And it really doesn't do a heck of a lot in the cell body. But rather the information flies down the axon and then terminates to another neuron here. And this neuron is actually within the central nervous system, the CNS, the brain or the spinal cord. So these trigeminal neurons, if you think about it, they have to do what? They have to pick up the information, the sensory information peripherally, and they have to convey it centrally. They have to get that information in there. So their axon is very long out there peripherally and has a very short process that goes in centrally then to share that information. This is the neuron we're interested in. This is the one associated with the cranial nerve. So it's these cell bodies in here represented by the little dots that represent the pseudo-unipolar cell body. Their processes have a peripheral and a central component. But that makes sense. They're picking up information peripherally and they have to share it centrally. Now, where that information ultimately goes, we're going to do tomorrow. But for today, we just want to know what the cranial nerves are doing and what modalities they're responsible for. So trigeminal, it's all about sensation from the face, the teeth, the gums, divided into three branches, ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular, represented by these terms V, not as in the letter V, but as in numeral 5, 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3. Great. So trigeminal was the first one we did that had two distinct functions, motor and sensory. Ocular motor had two motor functions. Now this one has two distinct functions. For completeness, these C's back here represent cervical. So cervical nerves associated with your cervical spinal cord project up into the back of the head and are responsible for sensory information to the back of the head and to the neck. So that's what these C's represent here. But for the important part of the head, which is the face, it's all about trigeminal. And then on the schematic, which is kind of funny, and don't ask me why this happened, but the human ear has this funny sharing of a bunch of nerves actually conveying there. In addition to some cervicals and trigeminal, we also have facial, glossopharyngeus, and vagus. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. And believe you me, you don't have to know because no one's going to come to you complaining, I can't feel my ear. Something, I just can't feel my ear, right? So you don't have to worry about that. It's just one of those curious things. Facial 7 is a really important one. And it really comes to this idea of you meeting people for the first time and what do you see? And again, as I said, the human brain is fixated on symmetry. And if you've ever met anybody with a bit of facial nerve paralysis, where you end up with a bit of an asymmetrical face, you really notice it. Or have you ever done those things where you can actually have the picture taken and they take the left hand, the right hand, and they take your two rights, your right and they flip it over, and your left and they flip it over? Okay, so I really, when I do that, I really can see that my face is slightly asymmetrical, right? But you really notice it then. So, and it's just one of those funny things about us. So the facial nerve is so critical because it's about the muscles of facial expression. So smiling, frowning, right? Raising your fork, you're furrowing your brow, all those things have to do with facial. So the muscles of facial expression. Voluntary motor. Facial nerve is coming out and innervating skeletal muscle over the face for you to smile, for you to frown, right? And importantly as well, for you to move your mouth to articulate words. So you can imagine if somebody had a unilateral lesion of facial, which that's exactly what happens, one-sided lesion, right? Not only would you have this droopiness of the face, right, but you would probably have some impairment with the formulation of words, right? They wouldn't be as clear as they normally are because you would have that asymmetry in the mouth for the articulation of sound, which are the words. Now, in addition to this really important function, which is all the motor activity, there actually are a few other little things. Now, one of them is completely nonsense, but I just put it up there to have it, and that's the sensory information from your external auditory meatus. Not a big deal. But the parasympathetics, the autonomics that travel along with facial, actually are very important for the glands of the head. And there are two of the three salivary glands, which are sublingual and submandibular, and we also have the lacrimal gland, right, for tearing. All right, so we have these three glands that receive these parasympathetic fibers associated with facial. So again, it's the squeezing out, right? It's these myoepithelial cells to squeeze out the fluids that are being produced in these glands and to have them excreted. So that's completely involuntary. You have no control over that, right? And so that's what's going on there. And then we now have a repetition here of a term, right? That anterior 2/3 of the tongue. If you think about the tongue, it does more than just detect foods that are hot or cold, right? But it's for taste. And so taste and sensory are under two completely separate nerves. Trigeminal, the mandibular branch of trigeminal, is responsible for that pain and temperature from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. But the taste fibers that are bringing back the information of taste are traveling with facial. Now, if you think about it, right, so we've got a big nerve, right, with motor information flowing out, some sensory information flowing back in. Taste is sensory, and this little bit of stuff here is sensory. And so we have a big nerve with all this sort of information flowing in and out. And there's a concept here that I want to sort of introduce now because it makes a lot of sense. So if you look at the territory that facial has to innervate for the muscles of facial expression, right, you really get where it's going. But if you think about those axons traveling along, right, and then they're ultimately going to, a few of those are going to go to the glands, they don't all travel together. And the whole idea of these parasympathetic fibers is the fact that they tend to be with the nerve initially, and then they jump off when they have to go somewhere else. And so these parasympathetics will be there for a certain period of time along the nerve, and then they just veer off and do their own thing. And so this is an important concept about these nerves. However, when you look at the function of each of these cranial nerves in totality, you have to think about which ones have the parasympathetic component. And so far, we've only had ocular motor and facial. And ocular motor was doing the ciliary muscles, right, for pupillary constriction, and pupillary constrictors and the ciliary muscles, and now we have these going to glands. So, again, the big concept here is the fact that it's a large nerve, and then what this nerve does, which is very curious, is the fact that it has, within the cranium, a bony canal that it travels through. And there are two openings on either end. So it basically, if you think about the nerve passing through this bony canal, there's an entryway and an exit way. Don't like to think of it that way. Just point A, there's one entry, there's one point where there's a foramen and another point. Because if you think about the inflowing sensory and outflowing motor, it's not really entry or exit, right? So what are those two foramini? That is what is important. The large one that the entire nerve can be found in before all these branches off it is the internal acoustic meatus, this large opening through which we're going to see another nerve pass through as well. And then, after all these different branches have come off it, going to serve other things, the nerve, with its facial motor component, passes through the styloid mastoid foramen. So if you actually sort of, palpate yourself right back here, there's a little foramen. You pinch it hard enough, you may actually feel something hurt. And it's a very, very tiny little foramen through which passes facial that's carrying now only the fibers for facial expression. So what does that mean? It means the fact that all these other branches having to do with taste, having to do with sensation, having to do with the parasympathetic component have jumped off the nerve in that bony passageway. So, when we look at the internal acoustic meatus, 100% of facial is associated here. 100%. But only a portion of facial is found here at the styloid mastoid foramen. And all of these axons are the ones for the facial expression. Which means that in this bony canal, it gives off the fibers that are going to the glands. It receives the taste fibers coming in. Right? So if you think about it, facial is a little interesting in so much as the fact that as it passes through this canal, it gives off or receives different branches depending on if it's incoming sensory or outgoing parasympathetic involuntary motor. But the bottom line of it is, and very important clinically for you, is that you recognize that this styloid mastoid foramen, that the axons that pass through here are all motor, all voluntary for facial expression. So then trauma, so you imagine now trauma, right? So this is probably a very vulnerable little area. And trauma that would occur here would knock out this function of facial, but not all the functions. You get that? So if there was trauma right here at the side of the neck on the one side, you would actually have that ipsilateral, right, facial paralysis on the one side where the lesion is. But the other functions having to do with facial, the innervation of the glands, picking up taste fibers, etc., would be unaffected because they're not damaged in here. Unfortunately, at that internal acoustic meatus is a site that's prone to give rise to really nasty schwannomas. And if you think that Schwann cells are myelinating the axons found within this nerve, and this is a very tight little foramen through which two cranial nerves are passing, facial being one of them, that a slow-growing tumor here would actually pinch off those nerves. Now, it's 100% of facial's function. It's the muscles of facial expression. You would interrupt the incoming taste information. You would interrupt the outgoing parasympathetic information. Everything would be affected if there was a lesion at that internal acoustic meatus. So that's an important aspect of facial. It's this canal into which other aspects are joining or jumping off the nerve, and that at that styloid-mastoid foramen is where only the axons associated with facial expression are associated. Now, just like trigeminal, and because it's so important, it's not one nerve, right? Then facial branches off and then into distinct nerves, right? Distinct nerve branches. Temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical. And again, there are some very naughty mnemonics out there about how to memorize these, none of which I'm going to tell you. But having said that, though, look at the names. Tell you exactly where these branches are going, right? And if you think about it, right, they have to cover the entire face. So, temporal, right? Temporal part of your head. Zygomatic, the zygomatic arch. Buccal is your cheek, right? Mandibular, and then cervical. The names make perfect sense. Okay. Now, what glands are we talking about here? So, two of the three salivary glands that receive this autonomic innervation are the sublingual and the submandibular. And then their names tell you where they're located. Sublingual below the tongue, submandibular below the mandible. Now, we think about these being motor fibers. We're causing secretion by squeezing the glands, right? But it's involuntary. And we're going to see, probably not today, first thing tomorrow morning, how the autonomic nervous system is organized into two neuron chains. There's a first and a second neuron. And these first neurons, their axons are traveling with facial and ultimately going to find these ganglia. And again, ganglia just refer to a collection of neurons outside of the brain, the spinal cord. And so there are these different ganglia that we're going to see that are associated with these two salivary glands, or the one ganglia up here associated with the lacrimal gland. But the bottom line of it is the fact that when you think about the activity of these glands, that there is a component here that's traveling with facial and ultimately getting there via these different ganglia that they branch into. The chorda tympani is the nerve, the name of the nerve, that actually carries the taste fibers from the tongue. So do you remember that from gross anatomy? Chorda tympani? Kind of? Chorda tympani? So it actually joins the lingual nerve, the branch of mandibular, but it's actually carrying the taste fibers. If you think about taste, happens in the tongue, you've got to get back to the brain. I've got to go into what I'm tasting. So that's the sensory component. So, the tongue, the human tongue has a curious structure. So far, we can divide it into different divisions and start asking ourselves about what it does. So, think about the human tongue. It's something like this. And then I think you all know that when you stick your tongue out, you can kind of see this big V kind of structure here. These are the large, maybe remember what those are called from histology? The circumvallate papillae. Okay. So anyway, it gives you an anterior 2/3 and a posterior 1/3. So, for, let's just say pain, general sensation, we actually had here V3. And for taste, it's actually being transmitted back by 7. So we haven't filled it in yet. There's still a bit more to come. So the human tongue. Anterior 2/3, posterior 1/3. So I give you these schematics to help you sort of, again, identify it. I'm not expecting you to know any of these, like major, to rhyme off all this stuff on a picture I would give you. Not at all. I mean, for me, the important thing is that you understand what facial does, and we'll be getting into how it would present with regard to lesion. But the bottom line of it is the fact that it's the muscles of facial expression, and there are these other autonomic fibers that travel with it that are providing innervation to 2 of the 3 salivary glands, sublingual, submandibular, and as well as lacrimal. So that other nerve that passes through the internal acoustic meatus is number 8, vestibulocochlear. So 8 and 7 pass through that very small opening, the internal acoustic meatus. So imagine now that individual has got a really nasty schwannoma. All right? So in addition to the facial paralysis, all right, this facial drooping on the one side, you can imagine that this individual would have some degree of hearing impairment, right, in that ear. And what else would you expect that person to have with regard to the vestibular apparatus? Yeah, I mean, there'd be a real problem with balance, right? Steadiness. There'd probably like nausea, vomiting associated with it. You know, you really feel unwell and not quite sure where they are in space. And that would be a very, very nasty tumor to have to remove. They're very, very deep, and they're very, not very pleasant things. So this nerve is all about special sensation. The cochlear part of it, it's all about hearing. The vestibular apparati are all about where you are in space, right? And so it's a very straightforward nerve. The 2 travel together. They're not related at all together, right, functionally. It's just the fact that they seem to be located in the same place, which is in the inner ear, and their axons travel together and basically travel together, almost forming like one nerve, which has its 2 distinct components, vestibular and cochlear, and it's number 8. Now, the one thing I want to show you on this schematic there are 2 muscles on here. And one muscle we've already talked about just in passing, and that's this tensor tympani, which was innervated by trigeminal, which is not particularly important. But there's the smallest muscle in your body is this little one here called stapedius. And stapedius actually links up to the stapes. The stapes is one of the 3 ossicles, or little tiny bones in the middle ear. And the idea of the stapedius muscle is to prevent too much movement of these little bones. So facial is responsible for the innervation of stapedius. So that's actually a really important thing to circle there, or put a star next to, or whatever. Why is it important? Well, imagine we go back to our individual who's got the very, very nasty schwannoma in that internal acoustic meatus, which is cutting off 100% of facial function. So if you think that one of the things that facial does is innervate the smallest muscle of the body, stapedius. And stapedius is all about the dampening of the stapes. That is, it prevents it from moving too much when the tympanic membrane is vibrating with regard to sound. And what patients will say to you is the fact that in addition to the droopiness and which is causing them great distress, that sound is now, they're perceiving sound to be much louder than it is. So if they always listen to the TV at a setting of 10, they feel they now have to turn it down to a setting of 5 because the TV just sounds loud. Or the individual will tell a family member, stop raising your voice. It's just they perceive it to be much louder. And it's referred to as being hyperacusis. So hyperacusis is something that occurs that you'll see with facial nerve lesions because of this innervation of the smallest muscle, stapedius. And again, these things will always occur laterally on the affected side. Okay, so we're doing well. A few more and then we're done. Now, we get into the multiple function nerves. Nerves that are carrying all the things that are left over. And the one that definitely is a good example of this is glossopharyngeus. So glossopharyngeus actually has two motor functions, somatic and autonomic. It has sensory stuff going on, and it even has special sensory and visceral sensory things going on. So what are these things all about? So we just have to go through them one by one. So glossopharyngeus, if you want to look at it, there are some really important things on here and not so important things on here. So stylopharyngeus is one of the muscles of the pharynx, and it receives its innervation by glossopharyngeus. So stylopharyngeus is a muscle of the pharynx. So there's one way of remembering it: glossopharyngeus, stylopharyngeus, kind of the same word there, which is helpful, I hope. So we have one more salivary gland left of the head. That's parotid. So the autonomic fibers that travel in glossopharyngeus are going to affect the secretion from the parotid gland. The other one, though, the sensory, is probably the one that's really important. If you think about it, you know, you'll encounter parents bringing in kids with ear infections, right? And so that inflammation of the middle ear, right, will actually be the pain fibers are being picked up by glossopharyngeus. Just kind of curious. So we've got sensation from the middle ear. We've got, again, that external auditory meatus, which is not important. But look at our tongue. Now when it comes to general sensation, pain and temperature, from the posterior one-third of the tongue, it's glossopharyngeus number 9. But the great thing is, so is taste. So now, when it comes to sensation, we've got the tongue completely mapped out. So between that anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3, we actually have a sharing of 3 different nerves. The mandibular branch of trigeminal, and then facial for the anterior 2/3, and just glossopharyngeus doing this posterior 1/3. So that makes it a bit easy. With regard to this last one here, it turns out that the brain, and you know, the brain likes to keep a track of everything. The brain likes to know what's going on in your blood supply. It wants to know the pressure in your arterial blood, and it wants to know the constituents of your arterial blood. And to gauge that information, it actually picks up chemical information and pressure information that are actually conveyed by glossopharyngeus. And these structures actually occur at the bifurcation of the carotid. So these structures called carotid body, carotid sinus. You'll actually find there's a bifurcation of the carotids in the neck. They occur bilaterally. And basically the idea here is just to pick up information about arterial blood. What's the pressure? What's the chemical composition? And to get that sensory information back to the brain, it's conveyed by glossopharyngeus. So there's the one salivary gland left over. Then we have our parotid gland, and there's our muscle, the stylopharyngeus, part of the pharynx. And then we have our posterior 1/3 of the tongue for pain and temperature, as well as for taste. And then we just have basically just everything here too. Now, with regard to these ganglia and all these other nerves, etc., you know, unless I mention it specifically by name, like in the autonomic lecture, don't worry about it. So, those are the components of glossopharyngeus. So when you look at it, I know it's like a long shopping list, but there's not a heck of a lot there. Now, the one last thing that I need to mention is the fact that glossopharyngeus is really the one that you test by the gag reflex. So by the soft palate, by touching the soft palate, and people have a gag reflex, that sensory information from the palate being conveyed by glossopharyngeus, and so that's actually how you test the activity of this particular nerve and what it's doing. Because people aren't going to come and complain to you about loss of sensation of their posterior 1/3 of their tongue, right? It's probably not going to happen. Right. So, vagus, the wanderer. So up until now, all 9 we've done so far have remained in the head and neck. Vagus is the one that leaves the head and neck and goes off somewhere else. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't do things in the head and neck, which it actually does. And if you look at it, there are some really important ones here for us. So if you look at the motor component, it's doing the pharyngeal muscles, laryngeal muscles, and palatal muscles. And we have some exceptions here, right? So we think about all the pharyngeal muscles except stylopharyngeus, which was done by glossopharyngeus. And then we actually have all the palatal muscles except for the tensor pallidi, which is actually the mandibular branch of trigeminal. But vagus is completely responsible for the laryngeal muscles, speech, your voluntary ability to formulate words, originating in your voice box and then modified by the tongue, the mouth, right? All motor activity, but vagus is responsible for voice. And that is absolutely critical. The parasympathetic fibers, these autonomic fibers, actually clearly must leave the head because they go off then to do things in the heart, the lungs, the digestive tract, right? And so I'll come back to that when I do the autonomic lecture. As much as it's doing motor activity of the pharynx, etc., it's also doing sensory activity from those areas as well. And then believe it or not, there actually is taste buds way back in the epiglottis, way back down here. No one's ever going to complain about that, right? I mean, that's not going to be a big deal. So, and you're not probably even going to be able to test it. And then finally, as much as we have these chemo and baroreceptors on the carotid bodies and sinuses, we actually have them on the arch of the aorta as well. And so vagus, because it's going down there anyway, actually picks up more of these chemo and baroreceptive information from arterial blood to share with the central nervous system. And those are conveyed, again, sensory information by vagus. So, sorry, back to vagus. So, all pharyngeal muscles with an exception, all palatal muscles with an exception, and all laryngeal muscles with no exception. Taste, sensation, oh yeah, okay, and some chemobaroreceptors. But clearly, if something is wrong with vagus, the individual is going to complain that the sound of their own voice is not the same as it used to be. Or others are saying the sound of your voice has changed. Because if you look at these other things, they're not really all that detectable, right? But definitely, if the voice box was not working properly, right, that would be detected by the individual, by the people they talk with. And then basically there's a whole bunch of anatomy on here as well that we've done before. And then our last two. Our last two are completely motor, and one has to do more with the neck, and the other one has to do with the tongue. Spinal accessory is all about innervation of the sternomastoid or sternocleidomastoid and the upper part of the trapezius. And that's all about the shrugging of your shoulders. So you want to test the activity of that nerve. Dr. Cooper's probably told you, put 2 hands on their shoulder and ask them to shrug their shoulders to see if there's good symmetry or if there's notable asymmetry in their ability to shrug their shoulders. Kind of important. But 12 is clearly very important. All motor innervating the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. And it's important because the tongue is required for eating, processing our food, but definitely more important for the articulation of speech. And so clearly people with something wrong with their hypoglossal nerve, the hypoglossal nerve will actually have some degree of impairment. Now, what's interesting is now we can finish our human tongue, and on this side put on motor, and we only have to think about one nerve for everything, and that actually is 12. So, if I were just to draw to you now, if we think about the human tongue, and there really is a very prominent left and right. And back in the brainstem, we actually have left and right motor neurons, hypoglossal motor neurons that are coming down with their axons to innervate that skeletal muscle. So if there was some sort of trauma in the neck, maybe some lesion growing that was impairing the functioning of the hypoglossal nerve, and you knocked out the left hypoglossal nerve, what ends up happening to that muscle? Dr. Cooper probably told you all about this. Kind of atrophies. So there's a wonderful relationship between nerves and skeletal muscle. And that is, they depend on each other. So you might not think that just because an axon no longer innervates skeletal muscle, that it would keep its normal function. In fact, skeletal muscle knows when it's not innervated anymore. Knows. You know what I mean? Knows it's not innervated anymore. Something is wrong. And what happens is the fact that these skeletal muscles actually begin to wither. And when you look at the human tongue of someone who has a hypoglossal lesion, remember these things are always on the one side, they're never bilateral. So if they have a lesion on the left side, and you just look in their mouth, you'll see the fact that on the one side the tongue looks withered. Now if you think about it, you ask them to protrude their tongue out to you, stick their tongue out to you. What's it going to do? And the really cool thing about hypoglossal is the fact that the tongue will deviate to the side of the lesion. Why is that? Well, it turns out that there actually are two sets of muscles in your tongue, left and right. And the reason why when you protrude your tongue out and it comes in a nice midline straight out is because the two are working against each other. Left is pushing right, right is pushing left, and boom, they come out straight. If left is not working, the tongue protrudes and right now pushes it over to the lesion side. And so that's always a great indicator for you. Visually you'll see it, but you'll know the fact the lesion's got to be on the side to which the tongue protrudes. Okay? So it will actually, you ask them to stick their tongue out, even though the right is completely intact, all those muscle fibers move and push it to the one side. Cool. So this is a breakdown of all the information that we've given. Now, there's too much information on these schematics because they're giving you a lot of these nuclei within the brainstem. Now, some of these we will do, and other of these we're not going to do. So you can come back to it, not for today, but you can come back to it when you can look at this chart and go, yeah, I remember Dr. Kwanzaa mentioning Edinger-Westphal, or what else would we do? Trigeminal nucleus and stuff like that. But for right now, just recognize these charts are there to help you later on to get all this information. Look, depending on what you end up doing, for instance, if you went off and did radiology, no two ways about it, you'd have to know all these different foramina of the cranium, right? And all of these nerves need to pass through the cranium. And so, now, have you done an osteology thing and basically sat there and looked at the... No. Well, you have. And have you sat there and, like, gone through all the names and asked yourself what passes through here? And... Oh, okay. So, in light of that, then we'll just say the fact that, look, we've got all our cranial nerves here. There are specific foramina to which they pass. You know, you don't have to commit these things to memory. This is not nearly as important as this. Now, if you've got all this, you know all the functions, you know how people would present with lesions, then you can certainly add on all the osteology. But because it's no good, for instance, at the end of the week, and I ask a really simple question that, you know, ocular motor, you know, has all the following functions except, or which is a function of facial, you know, and you don't quite have it yet, then I would say don't worry at all about the bones. You have to worry about the function. You have to know it. And I think I've imparted to you my very strong feelings about why you need to know this. So there they are all here, and you can certainly go through it on your own. All right. So I got 10 minutes. So why don't I just sort of just start just by mentioning the autonomic nervous system, and then we'll stop, and we'll I'll just mention it as to basically what's going on. So the autonomic nervous system. So that's all I'm going to say, then we'll stop. The autonomic nervous system. Look, it's that part of your nervous system that's the involuntary side of it. So as much as we talk about the voluntary articulation of words, the voluntary movement of your eyes, right? This is the involuntary part. And there are involuntary actions in the head, and there are involuntary actions in the body. And the autonomic nervous system works, and you already know, from a pharmacological point of view or a physiological point of view, in this yin and yang kind of thing. This balance against each other, right? With one tug of war between each other. When one is on, the other one is off, right? And vice versa. The two basic components of the autonomic nervous system are sympathetic, parasympathetic. You know that. So, extending your knowledge from pharmacology or whoever's done the autonomic nervous system up until now, let me ask you this. Has anybody done this sort of stuff with you about the anatomy, the neuroanatomy of the autonomic nervous system? No, right? Okay, that's why this is important. So, we'll pick up tomorrow is going through it because we need to recognize what these two systems do, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. We need to understand which cranial nerves carry autonomic function and what are the autonomic functions in the rest of the body. And how do these two systems, are they similar and how are they different? These are really important core concepts. And other than that, it's not to get bogged down in the minutiae of the names of certain ganglia or certain nuclei, but to have a really good understanding of the autonomic components in the cranial nerves, because those are the ones you're going to be looking at, right? And to have a good understanding of how these systems are similar and different in the rest of the body. And then we'll be able to, I think that should just take probably just the first half hour tomorrow morning. And maybe a lot, maybe longer. But then, so tomorrow, so just so we know this now, so tomorrow we'll do autonomic, in case you need to print out your handouts or get them. So tomorrow we'll definitely be doing motor and maybe start sensory. So on my thing here, that's lectures 5, 8, and 9. Okay? Great. Now, let me turn off integrity. I got something else to say. Let me do that first. Did I do it?